And now we're going to talk about the framework of what we're talking in the PMP training and the understanding of how project managers work. This is the foundation. This is the structure that most projects have in common. And so the language here is fundamental to taking the test because it's assumed that you have this background based on your experience as a project manager and working in projects. These types of terms and information is needed. So let's look at some fundamentals. What is a project? What's the definition? Well, it's a temporary, unique activity. It is progressively elaborated. Well, what does that mean? It means it happens over a period of time. It doesn't happen instantaneously. A project is assumed to be something that has a duration. There is something happening and people are doing something over a period of time. It's important that it be unique and that it be temporary. If it's an ongoing activity, it's really not a project. That's where we get operations from, that are repetitive, ongoing. Projects are looked at as something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is something that can be wrapped in a bundle, if you will. It can be looked at very specifically. And that's very important to understanding projects, project management, and being able to take the PMP exam, do what we're doing here. So, what's a project? It is temporary. It is unique. It is progressively elaborated. Its operational things are sort of the other side of the world that are repetitive and ongoing. Let me give you a good example. It's a project to clean out my garage. That's a project. I can look at it as being it's temporary because either it's going to be done or not. So it has to happen in a specific time frame. It's unique. I have never cleaned out, well, I have cleaned out my garage, but this effort of cleaning out my garage is unique. I have not done it in this time frame ever before. And even if I've cleaned it before, even if I know where the brooms are, I know where the boxes should go, I know all of the details from having done it before, it hasn't happened in this time frame. It's real people doing real things in real time is what projects are about. So it's unique. It's a unique activity. And it happens over a period of time. Now, we'll talk more about the details around this, of defining what it means to be successful, what it means to be progressively elaborated, etc. But just take it that a project needs to have these qualities to them. And we get confused with other activities that we do in work that are more repetitive, ongoing. I would say it's not a project to take the recycling to the curb every Tuesday. At my house, it's every Tuesday. That's not a project. That's an ongoing activity that I have to encounter, deal with the repercussions if I don't perform that activity. Same thing could be said for if you were putting your time in, if you have a time entry system that you get paid on. Well, that ongoing activity is more operational. It's not project-centric. You don't create a project to get your hours in. You don't create a project to do your reviews if you're reviewing your employees. Those are more operational, repetitive, ongoing things. It's important to understand the distinction between a project and operations because they do get cloudy at times. So thinking about these distinctions are important, and especially important when you're looking at taking a test on the skill sets, because the writers of the test, the question askers, are going to assume you have a clear understanding, and they will try and trip you with operational stuff in projects being clouded together. So, project has a triple constraint. This is the triple constraint that has been around for a long time in terms of project methodologies. Basically, you have a schedule, cost, and scope. Three things. If you take any one of those elements and change it when you're doing a project, you will affect the other two. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that if I double the scope of a project, what scope? Scope is what you're doing. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? If I'm cleaning my garage and the scope of that project becomes not just cleaning my garage, but cleaning my garage and the mudroom off the garage and the carport outside the garage, I have altered the scope. I have expanded the scope. Well, how does that affect the other two pieces of a triple constraint? Well, if I've changed scope, then I may affect the schedule. Can I do it in the same time frame? I don't know. Can I? Can I do it for the same cost? And realize here in projects, costs are different than, you have to understand the cost can be people cost, materials cost. We'll go into some detail about this when we get further. Suffice it right now that when you're looking at the simple project triple constraint, that if you affect any of these pieces, scope, schedule, cost, you may affect all of them. I like to look at it as a triangle, as we see here. Well, what's a triangle? It has a relationship between sides. So there's a relationship. If I were to expand this line further, I would affect the other lines if I were keeping it a triangle, right? So think of this as being related entities that cannot be looked at necessarily independent of each other. So when your boss comes to you and says, we're cutting the budget by 10% on a project, you have to look at how is that going to affect the schedule or the scope or both. All of them are connected, related, and it's important to keep that in mind. When taking the test, some of the questions are directly related to this simple version of the triple constraint. And realize that, recognize it when you're looking at the questions. And we'll talk more about that. Here is a project constraint model. What we've done, the organizing, governing bodies have taken that triple constraint and they've sort of morphed it over the years. They've given it more detail. And here's what they're looking at. Here, they center the constraint of a project on expectations. Well, what do we mean by that? In my simple example that I was talking about, expectations of a clean garage. We look at that very simple project. Well, whose expectations? Well, it would be mine because I want to clean it. But would there be other expectations that need to be met for that project to be looked at as successful, as complete? So here, expectations hold a centerpiece in this model. And in my example, whose expectations do I need to deal with? Well, I have a wife, so if I'm doing this in part to comply with her expectations, I'd better know what she expects a clean garage to look like. I mean, if it's my expectation that I've, swept it and put some boxes on shelves, and her expectation is she's parking her car in the garage, those are different. Those may not be the same expectations. A lot of projects fail because of lack of expectation management between a project manager, project team, sponsors, stakeholders. We'll talk a lot about this. But here's where this is the model that gives you some structure, some framework to hold that on. So expectations, very important. You have scope and quality. They've added quality here with scope. Why? Why do you think quality is added here? What does quality mean in this context? When we look at projects, we look at what are we expected to do, but the what necessarily has a quality component. It's not just I need it done, but I need it done to a certain degree, quality, etc. Do I need to pressure wash my garage to say it's clean, or simply sweeping it? When I build software, if I'm doing a software project, it matters just how good the software works, how many defects are acceptable. And those of you who think that 0 defects is always the rule, that anyone who's ever had a commercial word processing program knows that that's just not the case. We always are looking at defects and bugs and revisions, etc. It happens to everyone. It happens in cars, what's acceptable. Now, what's not acceptable in a car that's transporting you safely is different than maybe software. And different software packages may be different. I use the example of if I were doing a conversion of a medical database. So think about that. A medical database. What kind of information is in there? Well, it may be acceptable in a different software package to mistranslate or load or move a piece of information like a radial button that goes on and off. But what if that button, that on-off button, is do you have allergies? And you get it wrong when you move the information from the original to the new. Well, that translation, that switch being wrong, can actually be fatal, not just inconvenient. So it matters the type of data that we're dealing with. So, as they say, the devil is in the details. Details are important. Here, we're just looking at the concept of scope and quality. What's the quality of that thing we're trying to do, the what, if you will, of the project. So we'll look at that. We also look at schedule time, and these are evolving. In the newer versions of our materials, we're going to be looking at schedule management. It used to be called project time management. Schedule management, time management, here it's basically the same kind of concept, so don't worry about it. What we're talking here is just things because a project happens over time and it hadn't happened yet, or we're in the process of it, we need to look at how we put this on an actual calendar, looking at real days and real resources. We'll see here in a minute. But we look at the time, the schedule that a project actually unfolds, comes into being. Software package. We need to look at, how long it takes for the software to be developed, tested, rolled out, new equipment put in place. What are all the different moving pieces? And every project has their own moving pieces, and they move in a time frame. And time is one of those things we can't get away from. We only have 24 hours a day. That's it. It's one of those immovable realities of life. Now we can emulate the creation of time in certain ways, and we will talk about that. But the reality is you and I only have 24 hours a day. I can choose not to sleep and get more time, but I can't create 25 hours. That 25th hour is not within my ability to create for myself or for you. It's managing that time more effectively. So, the last piece here, cost and resources. Resources are everything from the people that you need, if I'm building a house, I may need carpenters, plumbers, electricians, etc. But I also may need a certain piece of machinery, a forklift, a boom-operated device to put the roof on. I may need a concrete truck. Those are resources necessary for the success of that project. Here we're looking at that, and each resource has an affected cost. People and things cost money. That's where we look at it here. So when we look at this constraint and we see scope, quality, schedule, time, cost, resources surrounding this expectation, what are we trying to accomplish? So it's, what do I want to accomplish? When do I want to accomplish it? And how much am I going to cost? What's the resource that is going to be necessary to accomplish that? We have things surrounding this. In this constraint model, we look at this as in a corporate setting. So there's organizational factors, and we'll talk about those in a bit of detail here. We also have the technology. I mean, how technical are we dealing with? I'm sweeping out the garage. Am I building the software in a C+ environment? Is it a mainframe environment? Is it a web-based? Is it cloud-based? I mean, there's lots of technology choices that we deal with all the time. And those have to be considered as part of this constraint model. We have standards and processes. Basically, we have to stay out of jail, and we have to go according to the standards of our business. You can't have concrete that's substandard. I may not be able to sweep my garage out into the street. There may be ordinances that say, you have to bag up all that. So these are things that we deal with regularly. When we deal in project management, we try and look at all the minutia, the detail, and we try and take it into account. Now, we don't need to be so focused on it that we can't get work done. But having it understand that it's there keeps us from making mistakes. It helps us manage the expectations that our stakeholders and our sponsors and that we have But we have to take into account, what are the standards out there? What are the processes I have to go through? Do I need a building permit for something? Do I have to get regulatory understanding before I put a new piece of software out there on the market? All of those are important pieces. And most of you that are looking at this, you're doing projects. I'm just pointing out the obvious, if you will. But we have to keep all these factors in mind when we go to take the test, when we go to get certified, because these are the kinds of things that will be assumed that you need to have already thought through, or at least look for in the scenarios, in the questions. We also have the stakeholders, which I've already mentioned as an important piece. These are the people that are affected by your project. Your stakeholders can be everything from, as I mentioned with cleaning my garage, my wife would be a stakeholder. So would my kids. So may my neighbors, depending on the defined scope of that. Stakeholders in your corporate work may be your customers, it may be your sponsors, your boss, it may be the people that you're working with. It could be that you're putting in a piece of software that will replace someone's functionality. Think about how technology makes one thing more important and another thing obsolete. Have you ever heard of a key punch operator? If you haven't, look it up. But it was a time that computers had to have someone who punched keys on a keyboard to be able to write code. That particular skill set is now obsolete because we don't have our code done that way. We've evolved, we've gotten better technology. But the idea here is if you take someone's skills away, or you take their what they do, if you take their functionality of their job away, they can also are stakeholders. They have a stake in it. They have something that they could expect or not expect. That the project, remember, the project is unique and it is something that hasn't happened before. So the idea of stakeholders, keep a very open mind about stakeholders. They can be people affected positively and negatively. They can be people fully engaged or not engaged at all, but you have to keep them in mind all the same. So, then we add this last category of risk. What is risk? Risk is what might happen. I could get in my car today and I have a risk of an accident. So anytime I get in the car, there is a risk. It's part of having a car. It's part of getting in the car. It's part of driving the car. There are risks. Everything we do has a certain amount of risk because we are not wrapped in a shell somewhere. We are moving through life. Remember, real people doing real things in real time. That's what projects are. Real people doing real things in real life, in real time. Risk is part of it. In project management, we try to identify it, and we have a fairly elaborate way of doing that. Not only identifying it, we try and figure out exactly what the costs would be of the risk if it happened. We try and figure out who it would affect. We try and figure out a lot of detail around risk. Why? Why? Because it's expensive. When risks become issues, when something happens, it's no longer a risk. Okay? It is not a risk if someone hits my car while I'm driving it. It is not a risk. It becomes an issue. and we'll talk about that. But in this model, we don't want to ignore that risk happens. They are around, and we need to be aware of them. We need to manage them, and we need to talk about them. A lot of people are out there doing extensive risk management work with projects. So we will talk about that, and we will understand that that's something in our world, it's expected to be done. And now let's look, we've looked at projects, the constraints, the pieces around a project. Now we're going to look at programs. A lot of people throw the word program around, they throw the word project around. It's important that we have a clear understanding of what a project is and what a program is. In the land that we're going, in PMI mentality, to take an exam and understand what we're talking about, you need to be clear. A program is the grouping of different projects. It's logical, and it should be in such a configuration that it capitalizes on the benefits and there is a mutual understanding around those things. Now, here's a typical model program. Has 4 projects. And we look at the 4 different projects separately. They may be managed by 4 different project managers. There may be a program manager overseeing these projects. Maybe the program manager is actually managing one of the projects or more. It's completely independent. The point here is to understand that programs exist and they're different than projects. And here's a better example of it. So you're logically putting things together. There was a project in a state based on House Bill 1779. That was the name of the project. That was what was going on. Well, that wasn't just a project. It could be viewed as a program. And here's how we would look at it. You had vehicle property tax, which was the key piece of this. They were creating a vehicle property tax system. So your car, you pay a tax on your car. In this particular piece of legislature, vehicle property tax, you needed to have a system for the vehicle property tax. And it needed to be a statewide system, not a local system. So instead of getting vehicle property tax from your county or paying your county for your vehicle property tax, it was a statewide system. So that was one project. It had to be integrated with the Department of Motor Vehicles. Well, why is that? Well, if you're registering your car at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the goal was to not just pay your registration and have that trigger a bill coming to you for your vehicle property tax. It was to pay it together, so it was easier. It was better for the citizens because it was easier for them to have their tax, pay it, get it to the right people, and have it done in one way across the state, not in independent ways for every county. And this particular state had 100 different counties, so it was not insignificant when every county did something differently. The next piece, some of you are familiar with ETL. And it's basically, this is how you took the information from the older systems. You take it out, you extract it, you translate it, you figure out what it means, so you do some kind of adapting of that data, and then you load it into the new system. So this had to be done because you are going from 100 systems in 100 counties potentially to a single system. This was viewed again as a different project because it had different things that moved it, different people that had to deal with it. Some of the crossover between the different projects would have some crossover of some of the resources, of course, but they could be looked at independently. The last one was credit cards, completely separate from this effort of trying to make it convenient for the citizens of the state to be able to pay their vehicle property tax when they register their car every year and not have two different bills, which was problematic, have a unified system. Well, they also realized that the people that were typically doing the registration and taking that amount of money, they were doing it with cash and check only because it was $25, $35. So it wasn't a lot of money. So they were a cash and carry kind of mentality. And one of the ideas was, well, we need to take plastic. We need to take credit cards. We need to take debit cards. Because instead of taking $35 for registration, these agencies across the state that were going to implement this were now going to be taking both the registration and the tax. Well, in certain places, that tax may be over $100 for a new car. So they didn't want that much cash or checks floating in the system. And there's a good reason for that. Whenever you have a lot of cash floating in a system, there's a lot of chance for not such good things happening. So, my point is, we have a program here. It centers on a piece of legislation. It was broken into distinct pieces that could be looked at and managed separately and coordinated together under the guise of this program. Could it be worked as a project and these be sub-projects? Yes. Some of this is semantics, but understanding how projects are broken out, that programs do exist, is important, because in most of our work as project managers, as project professionals, we're dealing with larger things. I will use simple examples to help you understand it, but in your own work, you'll see the complexities. And having good language to break it into, pieces to break it down to, in your mind and in your conversations will help you. For the test, for taking an exam on this material, it's important for you to understand this is what the drafters of the test, the people who write the questions, are thinking about. And so they will have very specific concepts of project, of program. So, project, program, now portfolio. Now, you all heard about a portfolio. We all may have portfolios. A portfolio is a set of investments held by an organization or individual. So you may have stocks in companies. You may have properties, physical properties that are part of your portfolio. And an organization also looks at it this way. In portfolio management and looking at a portfolio as it associates with programs and with projects, it's important to understand that these are a collection of investments. Why am I pointing that out? Because a lot of us think that we're just doing work. And the important thing to keep in mind is that every project we do, it represents something that the company has deemed valuable. There's a cost benefit. There's a return on investment. There's a keeping us out of jail. There's a gathering more customers, keeping our existing customers. There's lots of reasons, but every one of our projects that we are engaged in has something to do with the investment of corporate assets, people and money, in order to fulfill or get something back. So it's important to understand. And a portfolio is different than a program in that a portfolio is just a set of things. And usually it's a portfolio under a business unit or a business grouping, maybe a VP, lots of different ways that they're physically created. But they all have in common that it's a collection of investments. It's things that we're spending corporate assets and are expecting something out of that. So, in project portfolio management, what we're trying to do is put some structure around it and put some rules, maybe some regulations, if not too heavy-handed, but we have a way of prioritizing, authorizing, etc. As you work in a projectized world, there may be hundreds of projects that are being done in your particular world. And not all of them have the same priority as other ones. And the prioritization of those projects, of where the money, where the people are being put, is not something that we always control, but we look at it from a project management point of view that it should be some effort to have reasoning behind it so that we identify, we look at what's happening underneath a portfolio, what projects, what programs. We look at identifying and prioritizing them. So prioritizing what's more important than something else, what brings us more rate of return, if that's a key goal, what is going to keep us out of jail, compliance issues. A lot of projects out there, and some of them do not have, they may not have the same kind of working mechanisms. For instance, in the phone company, we have number portability. You probably understand this nowadays very clearly. That just means that if you have a phone number, you may take it to another carrier and keep your phone number when you move your service from carrier to carrier. And it can work landline to wireless, wireless to wireless. It's very flexible now. Well, that whole initiative was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And I know because I worked for the phone company at the time. And what it said in brief is that phone carriers who had those phone numbers had to avail them and basically allow the customer to own the phone number, not the company. This was a compliance situation. Now, why do I talk about it in portfolio management? Because in this situation, it cost the companies a lot of money to comply with that regulation. But it was a regulation that was brought to us from higher up. We had no choice. So we had to promote and support this regulation of number portability. So it's a case where not everything is prioritized the same way. So just keep that in mind as you look at these. There should be guiding principles behind it, either making money, keeping customers, or staying out of jail. Those are the big three. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But these are, in portfolio management, it's kind of a structuring of projects and programs into reasonable units. Now, organizational project management. This is basically if you're working within a project. And this chart that you'll see here sort of breaks projects, programs, and portfolios down and gives you some information that helps you wrap your hands around them a little better. For instance, scope. The scope of a project is clearly defined. It's project objectives. What are you trying to do? The program scope may be bundling those projects together. It's aggregate. It's a grouping. Nothing different than what I've said before, just restating it a little differently so that you can see it and have a better understanding. A portfolio, it may be based on strategic objectives. One of them could be to keep, I use the term stay out of jail, keep all your regulatory things in place. A portfolio may also be specific to a business unit. We want to increase our sales by 20%, 10% over a period of time. So that those kinds of things can be organizationally driven. With change, we manage project change as project managers. And what change means is that we're doing real things in real time, real people. It's happening for real. Change happens. Things happen. We have to manage with those things happening. People coming, people leaving, organizational shifting, differences in technologies. All of these have to be taken into account. We manage change from a program level, and the changes could be inside or outside the program. Again, organizational changes can happen. Programs being a group of scope that are related to different projects. The program, we look at it a little differently. When you get to portfolio, again, we're larger. We get a little bit bigger because we're taking into account more diverse things. There may be pressures or legislature that we have to take into account on a portfolio level that we wouldn't have to take into account for every single project or even every program. When we're dealing with organizational project management, and we deal with planning here, in project management, we progressively elaborate the project objectives into work activities. And that simply means we break things into tasks, bigger tasks, smaller tasks. That way we can look at it more distinctly. In higher level planning, we do that with programs, and that is simply that we may figure out what we can do within our group, what we can do outside of our group, what resources we need to bring in that we don't have, how do we shift resources around, but we're not dealing on a task or activity level from a program perspective. It's more bigger picture, which makes sense. On portfolio, it's really dealing with, in the planning part of this, it's really dealing with processes and communications with the entire group. It may be with portfolio management in that concept that we have certain documents that have to be created, certain groups we have to go through, HR or some kind of procurement agencies. So those are things that we look at on a portfolio level of management to make sure that the processes are consistent. We don't want to reinvent how we procure vendors every time we go out and need a developer or a tester or anyone, project manager. You don't want to reinvent that. So it's good to have that level of detail at a higher level so that we share that information across a portfolio of different efforts, because we can have it be cheaper or more efficient or at least consistent. We know what we're looking at if we do it the same way across our portfolio. With management, we manage the team. So in projects, we're managing the people we're working with. We're managing the actual workers who perform the activities, that do the tasks. When we look at the program level, we're looking at managing the staff and the project managers, not the actual people doing it. So if I'm a program manager and I have a project manager or two working under me. Then I'm managing them. I'm talking to that staff, if you will, the group of people that are managing the people doing the activities. So that's how program management sort of looks in a organizational kind of setting. In portfolios, you're coordinating with staff. You're trying to communicate. You're trying to make sure that everyone knows who's responsible for which thing, which groups of things are together and have similarities. You try and leverage those things. There's some extensive portfolio management, and then there's some that is not. You'll find a lot of different things. From taking the test, understanding this from our PMI perspective, we need to understand that the portfolio management is looked at as being that conglomeration of programs and projects that are coordinated together. And that's what the perspective that they have. When they mention a portfolio, that's what they're talking about. In your average work, it may be slightly different, but understand we're trying to get you to understand the PMI kind of perspective in this. Success is looked at under the projects as being on time, on budget, on quality, on scope. You're trying to bring the triple constraint in. You are focused as a project manager on that. There's also in programs where you're looking at the project, but you also need to look at how the other projects are related to each other. You can get sort of in a very tightly focused mode with a project because that project is unique. And if you're the project manager, it is your sole focus, or it is a very strong focus for you. With a program, you have a broader focus. You're looking at how the other pieces work together. You may be coordinating resources. There's other things with, again, with the, you get success from that program's ability to deliver what you are trying to deliver. From a portfolio point of view, success is about bringing things in as you had expressed. Our return on investment, are we compliant? Are, what pieces are moving which direction? So it's really an aggregate, and making sure you don't have too many things that are costing you too much, making sure that you balance those things. Think about it as a portfolio in your personal life. Just draw the picture. A lot of portfolios for a personal investment has a balanced kind of viewpoint. Not everything's real risky, or not everything is real safe. We balance those kind of pieces. So we may have something that's very risky and something that's very safe. Now, the very safe ones don't pay as much. That's how that happens. The same thing happens when you look at a portfolio of projects. Some of them may promise to deliver a high yield of return, a great return on investment. Others, it's not going to return you a lot, but it's not very risky. It doesn't have a lot of problems with it. Exactly how we look at success with a portfolio. It's balance, and it's taking into account the individual factors. We'll talk about some more, but it's the risk factors. It's the comfort level of whoever owns the portfolio. Some people are risk takers. Some people aren't. Portfolios, projects, and programs have that in common. Now we monitor and we control the project work. Project managers do it. The portfolio usually has a higher level, maybe looking more at schedule and budget specifics and not at activities, work efforts. Just depends on how big and how complex you're working at. Some program managers work very detailed, some don't. Here, what we're trying to understand and grasp is that the project manager is dealing with the minutia of and controlling, monitoring the actual work being done. Think of it this way. If I were building a house, the project manager would be the one that's always around checking to make sure that the nails are nailed, that the paint is right, that the electricity is run properly and on time, et cetera, et cetera. I may be a program manager and have a community of houses being built. And I don't really look at, all the detail as the program manager. I may just talk with my project managers and see how they're doing. And I might get a status as easy as yay or nay. We're on time, we're on budget, and not get the level of detail of that the project manager needs to be able to do their job. Remember, if I'm building a house, I need to know when the concrete's being poured. Why? Because concrete takes a while to dry, and I can't do anything while it's drying. So it's important for us to get those kinds of activities straight and understood and on schedule and communicated, etc. Now, on a portfolio, monitoring is again, it's a higher level. And a lot of times, what we're looking at on a portfolio is dealing with the risk, looking at what is risky about the situation we're going into. It could be that it's not risky at all. It could be that it's extremely risky. But the different projects and programs underneath that portfolio, we have a higher visibility, less detail in the portfolio side than in the program or project side. So, in organizations, we are pretty much project-based organizations these days. But a project-based organization is what we'll focus on with this discussion, because that's really where we're going. You're training to be a professional project manager. And in doing that, and you're already doing it. So this should not be shocking and amazement. We're just getting you common language with this. But project-based organizations can be created in a little different ways. And what we're going to look at is how those different ways of organizing project-based organizations affect things. Generally, these are broad-based ideas that we're going to talk about. And most organizations are sort of hybrids of this. But for our sake, for thinking through it, we're going to talk about them as functional, matrix, and projectized as the different kinds of organizations that we will see in our careers. Now, within an organization, we have a governance of some sort. May be called governance, may not be, but it exists. Within our structure of what we're looking at for project management, we need to keep that in mind, that there is some structure that's going to be there. It may be policies, it may be, the hierarchy, the ethics, the culture, the risks that are there, the legal framework. Are you a not-for-profit organization? Are you a for-profit? How do you deal with that? What are the vision of the company? What are the strategies? What's the goal? What's the 5-year plan, if you will? But all of these organizational items, they are going to be a constraint. They're going to be a factor involved with the project. Some of them will be enabling, some of them won't. And the point is we need to understand it. And with the organization, there comes some certain types of organizational structures. Here we're looking at functional organizations. You have an executive, and they may have functional managers that have staff. In this particular structure, you don't see project at all. Why? Because the projects are typically embedded in these towers of functional managers with staff. So they're doing the projects. Almost every company has projects. It's just how they're put together. In a functional organization, you have this kind of straightforward functional staff type working. So these functional managers may have the coordination under them. They may be if you will, the ipso facto project managers for their groups. Or these may be nested together in a matrix kind of situation. Here we see how you have staff from different functional managers reporting possibly to a project manager. It is not unusual that a project manager has no direct report kind of duty. It's matrixed. Most of the organizations I've worked in my career were this way. You had different people that were dotted lined to you, so to speak. And what I'm talking about is your functional manager may be the staff may be reporting to a functional manager. So they have a development manager or a testing manager or an HR manager that they report to. But the staff reports to the project manager for the sake of that project, for the time of that project. So the project manager has certain administrative and certain duties that they can assign work to these people. And it may be directly or not. And there are different types of matrix. So that's what we're kind of talking about. You need to figure out in your situation how it works. And for the sake of looking at this as project management and being able to pass a test, you need to understand how matrix is viewed, because it's important. You have the coordination can be from a lot of different directions with a matrixed organization. And there are types of them. There's a weak matrix. That would happen if the project manager has very little power. Maybe they have to go to the functional managers to assign work. It could be that they are simply are note takers and have very little influence on the work that's being done, on who's doing what, on reporting back. But so weak is just what I said, weak matrix. You have a balance matrix, which typically happens in better functioning groups. And the balance matrix type of organization is giving some power to the project managers, but especially in contract situations. I've been a contract project manager myself for years. So in my situation, I may not have as much power as the functional manager who's a full employee. But I have some power. I can assign tasks. I can get input from the staff that's working. I don't have to go through a functional manager for every single thing that I do. With a strong matrix, typically the project manager has a lot more autonomy. They have a good deal of visibility with the staff that they're working with. They have a huge amount of ability to assign work and to hold people responsible for that work. So that's where the strength part of the matrix comes from. It's all centered on the project manager. All of these matrix concepts that we're talking about are directly related to what the project manager does. What are they trying to accomplish? So in the last type of organization, projectized, this is where it's not done a lot, but it does happen where you have a project manager who have specific staff assigned to them. You actually have fully developed project kind of groupings. And the project manager will have reporting to them, staff. This is typical of more of an employment situation than it is with contractors, though it can have interesting different variations. But here, understand, the project manager has the most power. The project manager in a projectized organization has the most power. They can make decisions. They have people that work for them directly, reporting structure, etc. So that's what we're talking about in a projectized world. And the coordination is done strictly from the project manager, and it's across the staff that they have. So that's why it's projectized. It's designed to be strongly in line with the projects that are happening within the program portfolio of an executive in this case. Organizational process assets. This is something that's fairly unique into this methodology we're talking about here, and it's an important piece of it because it's used over and over and over and over again when we look at the knowledge areas and the process groups and the processes that we deal with. These are inputs or outputs of those different things. We'll look at how that structure works in just a moment. But here are some of the process assets. In the organization, you may have configuration knowledge, configuration management knowledge bases that contain certain documentation that's already there. Think of it as your corporate history or your project history of things that have happened before and how you did it, lessons learned, things like that. You also may have financial databases that you deal with. And a financial database may be elaborate or it may be simple. It just depends on how your organization works it. But these are just possibilities of things so that you have information to be able to do and manage your projects better. There may be the historic lessons learned knowledge bases that are formally done. But all of these things are basically process assets that you have, things that already exist. There may be issues or defect databases that you know what breaks on a regular basis. What are the types of problems that you have if you're building an application? Or what are the type of challenges you would have if you were building a house? Or if you were trying to bring in any kind of resources or any information or anything into your project. So it's just a matter of seeking all the information you can, asking questions. You might also have some measurements of how processes work. How long does it take to do certain things? There are guidelines on how quickly concrete takes to cure. And it's specific to the humidity in the area. If you're in Florida and there's a high humidity, then concrete may take longer than in Arizona. It really is specific to where you are, what you're doing. But those are the kinds of things you can look for, you can ask about. You might have previous projects, may have files. One of the biggest assets that I've found as a contractor going in, as a project management professional coming into a group, is I like to look at what they've done before. How did they structure projects? What was the way they put things together? How did they track issues? How did they track risk? All of those types of things can be useful, especially if you're new into a organization or new into a project, to be able to have that kind of assets. And these should be there. Again, your calendars, your scheduled network diagrams, risk registers, responses that you had, any defined risk impacts. We'll talk a lot about risk in a later section, but here we're introducing these as assets, organizational process assets, and we will use these OPA terminology over and over and over again. Then you have enterprise environmental factors. The enterprise environmental factors are, again, a source of inputs, and it will have outputs from your different processes in the different knowledge areas. You have organizational culture, structure, governance, how things are. What do we do? Who are we? What kind of business do we run? And those are very important to understand. You also have how you are put together, just in geography. Are you distributed in your workforce? Are you centralized in your workforce? Do you have your servers sitting in Germany, but you're using them here? Is it a cloud-based technology? All those kinds of geography-based is part of the factors we have to take into account when we look at project management. You have your standards. We've talked about things already about industry standards, compliance issues, regulations, but this is where it kind of fits in when we look at processes and what the inputs and outputs are. The infrastructure that you're dealing with. I mean, it can be as easy as, do you have an internal network? Do you have an external network? Are you some type of hybrid? It just keep in mind all your infrastructure, how things are structured together is a factor in your environment, and it will affect the processes that you have. And your existing human resources. Now, your resources in general will be looked at too, but here we're strictly looking at who exists within our organization who can do certain things. Do we have a good database of that, those existing resources, skill sets on those people? Who can do what? You might have personnel administration is part of these factors. How do you have to handle personnel? How do we move people from one organization to another? How do we deal with that? Are we looking at moving people from location to location? In projects that deal with mergers of organizations, this can be a highly influential type factor. For instance, I worked with a government agency one time that had one group in West Virginia and one group outside of DC, and they were trying to combine those two different business units into one coordinated effort, one group. And it's very different type of working and understanding of a lot of things when you're dealing with that kind of diversity. I've also, when with the phone company, had different technical groups in different data centers, one in Washington State, one in Dallas, Texas, outside Dallas, Texas, and one in Georgia. Those three different units were in different time zones, and they had different backgrounds. So there were different rules that we had to take into account about how we even talk to them at times. So it's be aware. There are environmental factors, and you will influence them, and you will get influenced by them. We're in business. No matter if it's nonprofit or government, we have to deal with marketplace conditions. What's the market doing? In government, it can be as easy as, do we have a budget? Do we have, has the budget been signed? Are we ending our fiscal year? That happens in private as well, but it becomes even more pertinent when we're dealing with governmental entities that may shut things down, may shut projects down because of marketplace conditions. It may be that the marketplace condition can be new technologies that are happening, or it can be that different products are being introduced. When the phone company came out with the iPhone, It was a huge change of a lot of different things, both in terms of the marketplace that it created, as well as the technologies and a lot of the projects that were in process or had to be created specifically to support a different type of marketplace entry. Stakeholders' risks tolerances are part of these enterprise environmental factors. And what this is about is how risky are your stakeholders, your sponsors, your team members. Some people don't like to do risky things. They have a low tolerance for doing things that could go wrong. Others have an extremely high tolerance. They're risk takers, not risk avoiders. And knowing this, there is no right or wrong. There is nothing necessarily good about one extreme or another. The big thing is understanding it from a project management point of view. If you understand this factor as part of your enterprise environmental things you have to keep up with, know what your stakeholders' risk tolerance is. It will be very important because it will help you communicate and lead your project more successfully. And these are also things when we look at these factors, it's important because they can be parts of a larger question that you might be asked on a test. It may be part of the certification case studies that you have may involve these things. They're not off the table. They're part of it. And they work both as inputs and as outputs. You have political climate. I once worked a position in an election year, and the CIO of the organization that I worked for was served at the pleasure of the administration. So if we changed administrations, it might change that whole organization that I worked in. And the project I was working on bridged the time frame across that election and the incoming party. It just so happened that it did change parties, and that political climate changed with it. Sometimes priorities are made different. Sometimes nothing happens. It really is not a good or a bad. Again, it's a factor. Be aware of it. Don't be unaware that these things can be part of the influences into your projects. There are a lot of different commercial databases out there, meaning that other people are gathering data. We know this from marketing stuff that we see. We also know this because of the changing of how we are doing business, with all of us being online, and data has become much more available on all of us. So there are databases being created that are a factor. There can be commercial databases that are specific to industry and specific to your line of work, or even into project management itself. You can see certain things. So just, again, these are broad-based factors to take into account so you don't miss one. It may be something that will help you a great deal in being successful. We also have project management information systems which are out there. Some of them are very detailed and some of them are very perfunctory, and sometimes we don't even use them. But be aware that they exist, and that they may be a source of input for your organization, or you may be asked to feed one of these systems with information. It can be part of the output of your work effort. It can be something that you have to provide reports to or information to They exist. There's a lot out there. You can Google it and find lots of pieces there. In testing for your certification in this area, it's important to understand that these information systems not only exist but are highly valued by a lot of people. And so do not underestimate, if you don't work with one yourself, the value that some people put in these kinds of information systems that look very specific to a certain project management methodology or whatever. So we have examples of OPAs and EEFs for you. And these, we're going to hit a lot of these and talk about these. Please refer back to the significant list, and these examples will help you keep them in mind as we look at the processes that we have in this methodology. 1, does your organization have significant knowledge stored? Do you keep your knowledge? Do you have it available so that your project managers can, or project teams can access it? That would be an OPA. Do you have mature processes, mature systems in place? Well, what do I mean by mature? I mean, they've been around a while, they've been broken in, it's not the newest thing. I would say that iPhones are now a mature product. I would say that when they came out years ago, they weren't. They were still being created, programmed, understood, etc. Twitter was not mature when it first started. Now it is. It's been around for a while. We've figured out some of the trials and tribulations. Every company has new stuff and old stuff, whether it's processes or systems. Figure out what's out there. Is it mature? Does your company use mature project data on an ongoing basis? Do you have metrics that you wrap around it? We'll be talking about, and you'll be learning about earned value management and how those calculations can be used. Does your company use something like that? Or the capability maturity model, CMM. It's a standard, been around for a long time, but a lot of companies do not buy into its value or and do not use it on a regular basis. Does yours? These would be examples of your organizational assets, your process assets. Are you a legacy company of something? What's the level of your length of time in the marketplace? Do you come from an old industry? Were you spun off at one time? Were you merged at one time? Those are kinds of things that are important environmental factors for the enterprise. Is your C-suite, the executive suite, C-level executives, do they hate risky projects? It's this risk tolerance. But these are just specific examples of things you could ask yourself that will help to lead you into a better understanding of what you're dealing with projects. Company, you have a political component. Are you connected to some agenda? Are you into clean energy? I mean, this is not major problematic information. This should be fairly straightforward. I mean, do you have a political agenda? Well, if you're with a power company, yes, you do. There's a political agenda in there. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means it exists. Understanding that it's there is what we're talking about. Multinational company. Do you have to deal with a lot of people from overseas? Do they oversee you? I interviewed for a company one time on our Americans Memorial Day. And I did it because I was interviewing for a multinational company, and the two people I was interviewing with, one was in South Africa and the other was in Edinburgh, Scotland. So it was natural for me to interview on my holiday because it wasn't their holiday. Having that understanding of the differences, of the different time zones, of that is important when you're doing projects because it gives you a better understanding, and again, it helps you be successful. And the success of your project is really what we always drive towards. In this situation, we're also talking about the success of you being able to be certified to give you that certification, that credential that is important to a lot of people in the marketplace today. Are you up to date? Does your company, I worked for a company not too long ago that had rather old operating systems on them. And I wouldn't call them cutting edge, but I wouldn't call them obsolete either. But where are you? What is your company like? Those are factors that really need to be taken into account and will help you. I always ask, what do we, when I'm interviewing with people, I want to know, what kind of computers do we use? Do we have laptops? Are they desktops? Do we have tablets? I've sometimes been presented with portable devices on my day one, and sometimes I don't see a portable device in my entire engagement with different situations. So it's a valid piece of information that you do need in terms of how you do your job in project management. So now we're going to move into looking at the project management process groups. And the process groupings here are important. We have initiating, we plan, we execute, we control, and then we have the monitoring and controlling. And all of these groups are important. We will look at these groups and we'll also look at the knowledge areas that we study in project management in this particular flavor, which is a well-regarded way of looking at it. But if you look at this, just these process groups here, you have the beginning, you initiate. We plan, we execute, we keep planning. See the arrows going back and forth on the between planning and executing. As we are executing our project, we also are planning it or replanning it or refining our planning as we go. Then we have closing. So it's a beginning, a middle, and an end. As we're doing this, the project managers are thought to be the monitors and controlling agents, if you will. They're the people who kind of wrap these processes together and make them a project. So that's why in our model here, we have monitoring and controlling sort of circling the beginning, middle, and end of a project. We're always doing these things. One of the difficulties with project management and how we look at it, how we break it into pieces, is because it's hard to look at project management without looking at it in a quasi-linear fashion. Now, what I mean by that is we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We have things happen one after another. So there's sometimes feels to be an assumption that we have to finish one before we start another. In reality, project management happens in a much more dynamic way in most environments and for most people. You have a lot of planning and executing happening simultaneously. But when we study it, when we dissect it, which is what we're going to be doing here, we tend to see and look at it in a more linear progression. Now, I will point out times where this linear progression is not always as accurate to what we really do. But understand it's hard for you to look at it without that type of view. It has to be laid out some way. And so what we do is I warn you that it's not always linear, but then I lay it out in a linear progression. We will look at these processes that are out there. We will look at inputs to the process, outputs from the process. We will look at tools and techniques to each process. So we have our inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. When looking at this material, you'll see inputs, tools and techniques, outputs all over the place. It's part of how it is structured. And being that way, as I've said, it has a linear feel. Now, you may have things like documents that are already created and used, and they're inputs. Or it may be the organizational or enterprise factors we've talked about already. Some of those may be inputs into a process that we're doing. The tools and techniques may be few or varied, and not all of them are used in every case. We may have a process that gives you the option of 10 different tools or techniques to use. That doesn't mean everyone is used in all circumstances. Part of this process that we're going through and how you're learning this and being successful in this certification is to build your toolbox. It's to give you a lot of information, tools, techniques, how to think about this and be more successful as project managers, have a more successful experience as a project professional. Here we look at tools and techniques, then we get to the outputs, which are basically anything that is created that comes out of that process that we're talking about. Now we'll look at several processes through this, and knowing the processes specifically and the number of them and things like that is not as important as understanding the processes as they flow one from another and how they're created. Few questions are ever asked that are specific to a process that has a very specific answer to it. There may be a few. We'll touch on some of that. You'll see some of that happening. Mostly, what I want you to do is to take these processes and understand how that structure works with inputs, with outputs, with tools and techniques, so that you can have a clue, a better understanding, be able to look at practical problems of project management when they're given to you in a case study, and be able to discern what was the input here, what should the output be. But it's much more in tune with understanding it as it works than it is memorizing. Memorizing is not as you can, and some people are very good at it, and it's not something you shouldn't do, but it is not always the best path to grasping how the structure of this really works. It's understanding the bottom line structure. We'll get in more detail. You'll be fine. So, a little review. Key information, some key terms. We've talked about projects. We've defined them. We use it almost every other sentence. We talked about a program and the difference between a project and a program. How a program is combining different projects together, and a lot of it is semantics. But it's important to know that projects can be in a program, but programs are not in a project, so to speak. We looked at portfolios, and that's another larger grouping of things with significant strategic similarities. It can be the same group, the same stakeholder, sponsor, but it has a bigger, if you look at it as nesting, you have projects to programs to portfolios. Then you have the triple constraint, and we talked about this, and if the idea is a triangle. It is a triangle. The triple constraint is 3 different elements. We talked about it: scope, time, budget. We looked at matrixed organizations and how those sort of work. If you're looking at any questions on this information, you should always assume that the organization is matrixed unless otherwise stated. One of the tricks of this situation. We looked at enterprise environmental issues, things that might be out there that you need to understand because they're part of the environment of your organization. We looked at the organizational process assets. Those will also be important, both inputs and some outputs. And we looked at some of the process groups. We're going to get more in touch with the process groups and the individual processes themselves as we move forward with this. Now, I'm going to give you a number of how many processes are out there, and I will be doing that in a little bit later lecture. But I want to say it now that the processes have changed over the years, and there are new versions of some of this that are pending, meaning you can't see all of it all the time. But we're planning this particular lecture series around that newer information. So I want you to be aware of it. I'll probably say this multiple times, but I'm saying it now to make sure that we're clear. But we'll look at the process groups as we've seen them and the processes within those groups. And we'll look at the infamous inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, which we use this acronym, ITTO. And you'll see this acronym many, many times in lots of the material. It's sort of a go-to. A process will have inputs, tools and techniques, outputs. Every process we look at will have that structure. That's what lends itself to this linear kind of approach, which I will talk about and also fight against as we look at different processes that are not quite as concrete in that inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques as it may appear by just looking at it.